So, coming up, Indigenous research, seeing with our own eyes.
Shut up and sit down.
So in the previous part, I ended by asking you to have a look at that TED Talk, where a researcher talked about bringing together two knowledge systems. Now in this part, we're considering research undertaken entirely from an Indigenous perspective, and we'll look at the types of ontologies, epistemologies, and values that are available. So this is the concept of seeing with our own eyes. So again, we come across the notion of a paradigm, a particular way of seeing the world that's informed by philosophical assumptions about what's reality and what's knowledge and what's our value system, or to call those things by their fancy names, ontology, epistemology, and axiology. There you go. Just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? Are you bringing those terms into your conversations now over coffee and biscuits and such like? I hope so. Okay. Now, the Indigenous paradigm is on that spectrum that I spoke about way back in lecture 1 between positivism and constructionism. And if you remember, there was a third column on the table I presented, which was labelled critical theory. This is really where an Indigenous research paradigm sits. An Indigenous paradigm has been developed through that process whereby First Nations people, Indigenous people, who have experienced colonization, have developed their own methodology. Now, I spoke about that in part 3, when people, come together, how they recognize the diversity of their experiences, but also the commonalities that have shaped their worldviews. Now, this has been the thing from which an Indigenous research methodology has arrived, and an Indigenous research paradigm has been developed. And it's still developing. So it's that process of Indigenous peoples from around the world connecting together. And this paradigm, is still developing. It's not a process that's been completed, work in progress. That's what I'm after, isn't it? Work in progress. Now, there are 3 core aspects of this Indigenous paradigm. First, ethics should drive the research process. Second, people as spiritual beings who have multiple relationships with others and with the world, and those relationships should be nurtured through the research process. And third, the adoption of relational ethics, a relational ontology and a relational epistemology, which positions relationships as central to those 3 areas of the paradigm. So a qualitative paradigm is well suited to shift into that Indigenous paradigm. When you go over the content so far in this unit, you should find a nice fit here, between qualitative research and an Indigenous paradigm. The thing that is new to what we have already been discussing is the centrality of spirituality and the multiplicity of relationships. This is something that has not been fully embraced in qualitative research, where more work is needed. Now, first, let's have a closer look at this idea of relational ontology. Now, from this perspective of relational ontology, human beings are connected to the living and the non-living. So there's a relationship between the land, the earth, and living beings. And in this perspective, relationships are not I and we, rather, they are I and we rather than I and you. Did that make sense? I and we, not I and you. Okay. Right. So a guiding principle is that a person is because of others. So you can see how different this is from an understanding of reality from a Western perspective or Anglo-European perspective that sees the individual as a separate entity from others. This places relationships at the center of people's reality, and this is how the world is experienced. So a sense of belonging is derived from the experience of validation from all of those relationships. So this reality shapes people's experiences of who they are in relationship to others. Now, I quite like these two quotes. Excuse me. They're coming from Indigenous researcher Julie Atkinson. She says, land is not only a physical place, but a moral sphere, the seat of life and emotions, a place of the heart. So you can see this richer conceptualization of reality, outside of reality where objects and subjects are seen as separable. This is what we're talking about in relation to a relational ontology that has a spiritual component. So she also says, if the country is sick, people are sick. Now, you might realize from this last quote that this ontological position is not just one that's alien and that we need to kind of accommodate to, something that's different that's over there that those people use that maybe we just need to understand and maybe use it if we're working with those people over there. Actually, this paradigm is one that we can adopt. We could readily adopt it for ourselves. This is not all about being culturally sensitive to other groups, but actually about broadening our own understanding, our own knowledge systems, to allow ourselves to see that there are alternative ontological positions out there which we might just consider worth trying out for ourselves. The Indigenous ontology is actually proving to be quite an attractive one when thinking about how to get people to take the threat of climate change seriously. If the planet cooks, we cook with it. Hold on. That's something else, isn't it? I'm thinking of Hunger Games, aren't I? I'm thinking Mockingjay. Hunger Games.
And if we burn, you burn with us.
If we burn, you burn with us, isn't it? Love that film. Series of films. Anyway, back to the point. Right. So keywords here are commonly, collective, unit, and pluralism. Now, how about a relational epistemology? What's that all about? Well, in a relational system, knowledge is shared, but shared beyond the ways that we've been talking about in qualitative research, where we have that idea of knowledge being co-created between the researcher and the participant. That the interview data is a product of the relationship that occurred between the interviewer and the interviewee. In a relational epistemology, knowledge is also shared with the non-living. So knowledge is never discovered or owned by a researcher. It's not discovered and owned by the researcher and their participant. Knowledge is a product of relations with the living, but also with ancestors, and is also a product of the relationship between people, the land, and the spiritual world. And this is a vastly expanded set of interrelationships between knowledge and people. And this translates to an ethical imperative. You become responsible for making an ethical relationship, not only with your participant, but also with all those things that interconnect with the participant, with the individual, the relationships between people, and the relationships between people and country. So the research is also owned collectively, not owned by any one person. So it's not owned by the researcher, and this is very different to either a positivist or a constructionist approach to knowledge. Now, the relational axiology, what's that about? Well, this is built on the 4 R's. First, relational accountability, where all parts of the research process are related and the researcher is accountable to all relations, both spiritual, non-living, sentient and non-sentient. Second, respectful representation, how the researcher listens, pays attention, acknowledges and creates space for other voices and knowledges. Now, we've spoken about this under our discussion of colonialism. Now, here we're particularly concerned with how research represents colonized people. It's not just about how you write up research, it's about how you conduct yourself in a research project, in that research relationship, such as an interview. Research interview. how you manage that relationship.
I ask the questions, you answer the question.
Now, third, there's reciprocal appropriation, and this means that benefits accrue to both the communities and the researcher. This is, again, aiming towards a more equal distribution of the benefits of research.
What's a split?
50-50.
And fourth, we've got rights and regulations. Ethical protocols that accord the colonized ownership of the relation of the research process and the knowledge it's produced. So the ownership has shifted from the outsider owning the knowledge to an ethical relationship in which the participants in the research own the knowledge, own the research and its products.
That's mine. I called it.
No, it's not. It's mine.
Now, one of the ways this relationship is conceptualized is through the notion of Ubuntu, which is basically the concept of I am here because we are here. I mean, it's particularly so for this video. Like, I'm only on your screen if you're there, if you know what I mean. Right now, I only exist if you exist. The moment you turn your computer off, boom, I'm gone. Don't turn your computer off. I don't want to die in here. Okay. So, don't know quite where that came from. I'm experiencing some sort of existential angst today. Anyway. Okay, so we're interconnected. Back to the point. We're interconnected. It's also Ubuntu is also that name of the Linux distribution system. In the world of computer operating systems, the Ubuntu operating system. They chose that name because that operating system is open source, free software. It's available to everyone. It's actually co-developed with users. And it's actually really good and really secure software. Because if there's a problem, there's a huge community out there who fixes it quickly. You don't have to rely on the software developer to fix it. The users fix it. Anyway, sorry, I've got distracted again, haven't I? Sorry, that was quite nerdy. I've shown you my inner nerd. Oh dear. Okay. Anyway. So Ubuntu is a concept that came from the Bantu people of southern Africa. And this quote here comes from Desmond Tutu. And a quote captures the concept quite beautifully, I think. So I'll leave you to read it. Hit pause if you can't read. If you can't read really, really quickly, hit pause so you can read it in your own time. And again, don't forget to press play again, because there's more to come. Okay, so the Ubuntu idea turns on its head the idea in positivism that we're separate entities, that separates object of study from the subject that's doing the studying. Object, subject, making those things divisible, separate. Throws all of that stuff out the window, or turns it on its head. So let's get back to what we looked at during week 1. Remember that back then we spoke about positivist and constructivist paradigms. Constructivist is sometimes referred to as interpretive, and we also have the critical approach, which is sometimes also referred to as a transformative or liberatory approach. Liberatory is not to be confused with libations. Both are freeing, but in different ways. Okay, now I've added the indigenous approach to the table so you can see how the indigenous paradigm builds on the critical approach. So you can see that with an indigenous framework, it's starting to point to something a bit different. That the reason for doing research is different to the other paradigms. Also, the difference in relation to the ontological and epistemological assumptions. You see, there's a difference there. Now, qualitative research is rarely done under a positivist paradigm. It's often done under a constructionist paradigm or a critical theory paradigm, but it can be extended even further and become in many ways much deeper if it's connected to an indigenous perspective or an indigenous paradigm. Now, you don't have to be an indigenous person to adopt an indigenous perspective. Actually, there are many ways in which we would all benefit from adopting an indigenous perspective, particularly, around the issue of climate change, which I mentioned just before, where we get a fuller appreciation of our interrelationship with the physical environment. Okay. Now, from an ethical perspective, the Indigenous framework is guided by that notion of relational accountability. Now, I'm not going to talk about methodology in this video, but I will talk about it in part 5 of lecture 3, where I'm going to tell you all about the Idiri methodology, a particular methodology that comes from an Indigenous approach, in particular an Aboriginal methodology. Now, there are also different ways of gathering data. Now, an Indigenous framework can use interviews, diaries, and so on, but also extends beyond that to include what's known as ethnophilosophy and philosophic sagacity. Wow, I got through that. I'm not going to try it again. So what these are techniques used to capture those multiple relationships, the connections with spiritual and ancestral making those spiritual and ancestral connections. Talk stories and talk circles form a particularly important method when working with Aboriginal groups, but you can also adapt methods from other paradigms to fit this paradigm as well. Some adapt easier than others, so be wary of that. Now, I'll just give you a definition of, I've got to say it again, ethnophilosophy and philosophical sagacity. God, I'm good. So ethnophilosophy is the study of indigenous philosophical systems, and philosophical sagacity is recording the beliefs of certain special members of a community. So anyway, next part, in part, where are we? Part 5? Oh God, next part, I'll just say next. I've lost track. Part 5? Yeah, part 5. God, we're getting through this, aren't we? So, in the next part, I think it's part 5, we will look at the Idiri, the Indigenous Australian Research Methodology. I know I've said that twice now, but it's that important, So, till then, ta-da.